Oh yeah. Okay. So a couple quick comments on our schedule here. As we talked about last class period, way before fall break on the 10th. We are now on the 17th. We have, this is wrong. So we're not going into the Maya mug modeling today. We're going to talk a little bit about animation with the bottle. Hopefully everybody has a fully rigged bottle now because we're going to animate that today. I'm going to show you a couple of neat tricks about lighting and rendering. And I'm going to show you a couple of other ways to use deformers for modeling, because deformers don't have to just be for animation. So basically we're going to finish setting up our scene, talk about animating a jump, and then next class period, which is Friday, is open work time again. Even though I know we had 2 days off there, it still works best for you to just have work time. I'll be in here, I'll at least hop in here and check on everybody. I have some meetings, so that's something else we're going to be talking about. The reason I have to be in a meeting on Friday is something that will affect you in the future, which is midpoint review. For those of you, how many of you have sort of seen frantic sophomores running around trying to get stuff together for midpoint review? Anybody? It's happening, whether you can tell it or not. So all of the sophomore classes are in a midpoint review class, which is different than that midpoint portfolio thing we talked about last week. And midpoint review is where they take the work that they did in these classes, in the principles classes, and apply to a concentration. So what I have to do, or what we're going to do on Friday, is review those as faculty to determine who gets to continue on in the program. Okay, this is something you're going to go through, and it's something I want to take a whole class period to talk about. A combination of that and like job opportunities or like sort of future job prospects. What are the jobs that you can do in animation? So that's an upcoming lecture. I usually squeeze that in right up here on this jobs talks, mainly because project 3 has a tendency to be a heavy one. Like we do a lot of complicated stuff in there that breaks easily, and so I want to mainly be hands-on in there. But whenever we get an empty class day or a day when we can have a talk about that, that's where I'm going to squeeze that in. I try to make it right there either way, but there's a good chance we may be able to squeeze it in during this big chunk we have here. So the big thing is the project you're working on right now is due right there, the 22nd. It's due Monday, right? So we have today's class to sort of finish up the lecture about the animation, lighting, and rendering. Friday is open work time. If you're not working on that Friday, you definitely need to be working in other times. It's also worth mentioning that even if you are working on that Friday, you possibly still need to be working other times. Like there's not really enough class time allotted to get these projects finished. And there really shouldn't be. Like there should be some outside of class work time, right? In between now and then will be you finishing up that project. We're going to look at all of them on Monday the 22nd. Up on the board, again, we'll kind of do probably a similar layout. This class is still pretty big, which is good. That means you're all sticking with me. Like, that's, thanks. And then we're going to move into project 3. Okay, so just kind of chatting with you to kind of remind you where we're at and where we're going. Okay. And again, project 2, this is linked from D2L as well. This is what we're looking at. We've already talked about it, fully rendered, the bottle jumping once, or at least once, the ball bouncing at least twice. Fully rendered, and how it's graded is worth looking at if you can see this. There we go. So the way I've broken this up again, similar to the previous rubric. How many of you were able to see your previous rubric in the grade? Okay, cool. Just making sure, I don't see it from your end, so I want to make sure you're getting that feedback. So this is how I'll do it in there as well. Again, 5 is excellent, 4 is good, 3. I'm kind of basing this similarly to the Amazon review system, just because that's a system that everybody seems to be able to understand, right? But the 5 things that we're going to be looking at is the modeling, which is the modeling of your bottle mainly. the lighting and rendering, which we're going to be talking a little bit about today, the animation of the bottle, the animation of the ball, and then the overall presentation. Some of that's going to be camera, some of that's going to be like timing. It's going to be how does this present as an animated piece, right? So I show you this because then you know where to focus your efforts. So you're not spending hours and hours and hours, trying to get grass to work on the plane that they're bouncing on. And I'm like, grass would be great. I don't know that that's going to affect any of those except maybe overall presentation a little bit, right? So like that way you can focus your efforts on the things that are going to be the most impactful for you. Again, I also like to show this because let's say you did this project and you get 2s across the board. That does not mean 3, 4, and 5 is blocked off to you forever, right? You can improve each of those projects and grow them, right? Grow that grade. So I mentioned that. If I go to my revisions folder, got one person has turned something in, right? So I really want you to consider like submitting some revisions. Hopefully you all had some time to tweak around on that over the summer or over the fall break. I also want to point out we have a new folder up there for portfolio extra credit. I saw some people have already dropped some stuff in there. How many of you got to go to the portfolio reviews? Okay, cool. Either a selfie or a quick little paragraph about what it is that you saw while you were there. Not just any selfie, a selfie of yourself there at the event. That way you kind of have some evidence that you were there. I would really like to encourage you all to go to the last one, or the last 2, which will be at the end of the semester, and I'll give you the exact dates and times when that gets closer. It's usually the semester right before finals week, though. I'm sorry, the week right before finals week. And it's a little bit more polished. The pieces you'll see are a little more polished. But it's also the one where some people sometimes find out they're not graduating this semester. So it also is very tense at times. And we may have some of those this semester. We'll see how that goes. So, okay. Questions, comments about any of this stuff? Yes?
Project 3 is the last project?
Project 4 is the last project. So we, let's go back and look at the, so right now we are finishing up right here for Project 2, right? And we're going to start Project 3 up there. We're postponing that a little bit. So Project 3, the breakfast scene, ends right there on the 7th, right? And then that's where we kick off the final. So the final is Project 4, but I don't want to say this for all classes in digital media, but most of us just have like another project that is often a little bigger, a little bit more challenging as your final project. How that's graded is different between each teacher, but for me, I just count it as another project. It's just bigger and harder, right? And so we have a pretty decent chunk of time to work on that. Project 4, the final, probably should have listed that as Project 4, is sort of a full character that's rigged with a walk cycle. So that one's actually a lot of fun. The rigging part is challenging, but I think a lot of people really enjoy getting to make a character. That's why a lot of people are here, is they're excited about characters. So that one's another weird one because we have Thanksgiving break right in the middle of that. That kind of throws us off a little bit. Okay, any other questions? All right. How many of you have a rigged bottle you can start animating with today? All right. Cool. If not, follow along the best you can. We're going to be talking about a whole bunch of different little things. And again, I'm recording the video, so you can always watch this again later when it comes time to rig yours. Or when it comes time to animate yours. So quickly, we are going to get our Maya scene back up and going. So just another reminder of setting projects, right? My project is right here. And if I double click on that, you'll see that this is the path to it, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say copy that. And so I can go File, Set Project, and then I can just paste that into here, and that's where it's going to set my project. Okay. And now when I go File, Open Scene, I'm going to choose my, I think it's this one that I've done recently. Let's look and see. Yeah, so that's the one we did last class period. I remembered to save it. There we go. So this is the object I'm going to be animating today. Okay. Now, I believe, there we go. So I still have my bouncing ball in here, right? Still bouncing. Playback speed, real time. So hopefully, we'll test this out and see. What I was not taking into consideration when modeling this was scale, right? Because although that bouncing ball, when I was modeling it, I was thinking of it kind of as like a rubber ball, like maybe something you can hold in the palm of your hand, right, and bounce that way. Right now, scale-wise, it is much smaller, right? This is like a marble, maybe, and that is not bouncing the way a marble should bounce, right? There we go. So we're going to try something. It may or may not work. I really hope it works. Which is, I'm going to try scaling my bottle. Now, this will not always work. And so I think, oh, that's awesome that it does. So this will allow us to rescale it. Now, the reason this is working is because of our bottle control. It's simply scaling the size of these meshes that are underneath here and the size of these handles. Now, this is not always going to work with rigs. Okay, so I kind of show you this a little bit as a warning to take scale into consideration. I've seen a lot of projects be set back by weeks because one person modeled and rigged a character at one scale, another person modeled and rigged a character at another scale. They brought them together. They were two different scales, and it was really hard to resize one to work with the other. In this case, it works pretty well because we're using some simple deformers. If we're using skeletons, that's not going to work. So one of the things that I often do for scale is I just make a proxy object so I remember how big something is. Like I could have made just a ball the size of our bouncing ball and just kind of kept that back there in the background so I could model my bottle to that reference. There is an absolute scale in Maya. There is a way to see how big something actually is. And that is with these units down here. And I think we've talked about this in the past. Each of these little those little grid units is a Maya unit. And in Maya, that unit is going to equal an actual unit of measure, right? So by default, I'm pretty sure those are centimeters, okay? Which means that my bottle is actually smaller than it really would be in the real world. So we could always go the other way, scale up the bouncing ball instead of the bottle and get it all to the exact units. In most cases, it's not going to affect it too much until we start getting into stuff like physics. So I just wanted to remind you, scale is a thing. Once we get it to roughly where we want it to be, go ahead and turn my ground plane back on. You'll see now I have this bouncing ball and this bottle that I want to try to avoid it, right? I may even make it just a touch smaller. So really it just depends on how big you want this to feel, right? Now, I'm also going to delete this ground plane so we can talk about creating that fresh. Currently, my scene has a light in it. It's got this sun directional light. I'm just going to delete that. Yours probably has it too. That's sort of a hangover from previous versions of this file. We're going to talk about lighting, and we're going to talk about creating kind of a simple studio environment for this. So, with no lights in here, if I tried to render this, we're going to get just complete blackness, right? And that's okay, right? So no lights in scene, right? If I were to put an object in here, or an environment light in here, skylight, light, SkyDome light, and we're going to render it, we get this overall like white light is coming from everywhere. And so at least we can see it, but it's not doing anything good to it, right? Like this is not good lighting. So what I want to get first is some sort of scene, like a floor, some walls, something like that, just so I don't see the edge of the universe, right? It's not that this bottle is floating in space in, purgatory where it's, fighting off a bouncing ball, right? Like we want this to feel like it's an actual physical location. A lot of times part of our challenge in 3D is hiding from the audience that this is inside of a program, that we're faking all of this, right? We don't want them to lose belief in that. A lot of studio photography for objects sort of has that same issue, right? If we were taking a picture, a photograph of this bottle for a commercial, right? You don't want it sitting on somebody's kitchen table with like a kid like knocking something over and crying in the background, right? You want to take all of those distractions out so they can focus on the action, or on the object. So we kind of have that same issue. How do you present this animation in a way that we can take some of that stuff out of the equation, right? If I just put this on a plane, scale that plane up, when I render this, it looks a little bit better now. We got some shadows and stuff underneath there, right? But I can see that it's just floating in space. There's no believability in this world, right? So there's a couple of ways we could fake this, right? We could make it in a fake room, right? We could sort of duplicate this, Control D. This is, let me mention this again. I've seen this kind of as a habit that people have been doing, not only in this class and in other classes. Whenever you need to duplicate an object, please don't ever use Control C, Control V. So if I do Control D, watch what happens to plane 1 here. Control D, I just get a duplicate of it, right? Another mesh. Right? However, if I use Control C, Control V, I get a group with that mesh in it and a name that says pasted, right? And if I do Control C, Control V again, I get 2 groups with that mesh in there, and that starts getting really messy, right? So Control D just is a cleaner way of doing that. There's a reason to need to use Control C and V, but what Maya's trying to do there is preserve elements of that object that you honestly probably don't care about. You just wanted a duplicate of it. It's trying to duplicate it with all of the world space intact. So if you have keyframes on it, it's relative to the world, not to the object or something like that. Like it's something you don't care about. You just wanted another one, right? So Control D is going to be the best way to get that. So let's say I needed another wall for this. Control D, I got it. E, I'll go ahead and rotate this 90 degrees. What just happened? Object mode, there we go. And do D again. 90. And so we can make like a little fake room for it, right? And this works okay if I render this. Our scene's starting to get a little bit more, a little darker, right? But sometimes people don't want this because our eyes are drawn to convergence points, right? And so our bottle is what we're wanting the audience to focus on, and instead their eye is drawn to this little point in the corner where everything meets, right? It's drawn to right there. And so that can be a little distracting, and it's not that distracting, but in terms of composition, like you're like, why is this bottle in a corner? Like, what is happening in this scene? Like, that's not where I store my shampoo. So you kind of have to take some of that into consideration too. So a trick that a lot of people use to create sort of a non-distracting environment that feels kind of infinite and not really bothersome is to use that bend deformer we talked about before, right? So I'm going to go ahead and delete. Oops, just turned off my monitor. There we go. Turn it back on. Give me a second. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those other two. And I'm going to scale out here. I'm going to make this much bigger. Right? And since this is the original model, I'm going to give it a few more subdivisions just so it'll deform a little more smoothly. Let's do maybe 30. There we go. Now, there's a handful of ways you can do this. I do this one to show you that there's more uses for that bend tool than you may think. All right. So I'm going to go to Deform. It's worth noting that Deform is listed under modeling tools as well, because sometimes you just need to make a quick deformation to the entire model, right? So I'm going to go nonlinear, bend. And you'll see that if I turn up some of that curvature on the bend, nothing's really happening, and it's because it's trying to bend it in the axis where there is absolutely no depth, right? This is a plane. So if I rotate this to where it's 90 degrees like this in Z, 90, right? Then I can get this curve on it, right? Now I'm actually going to rotate that bend deformer again this way to get 90 this way as well. And the reason is because I kind of want to film my object from this side, right? And you're already starting to see we're getting an environment now that if I were to render this, like now my object is kind of in this like infinite world, right? We can play around with that a little bit more though, just by adjusting this bend deformer, right? I'm going to go ahead and take my low bound down. Oh, I'll go ahead and leave my low bound because of the way I rotated it. Maybe take my high bound, whichever is this side of it, take that down to completely 0. Right? So now it's flat. And then I want you to notice that if I move this object, I can change where that bend happens. I can also scale this object. If I hold R and scale it, and I can make that bend happen a little more sharply. Right? And so then I can set my curvature to something like 90, like this, right? And I have this backing wall that I can adjust wherever I want it to be. Now, the problem with this is if I ever decide to move any of this stuff, it's all going to break, right? So usually I get mine to where I want it to be. Right? So I can also slide my object in one axis to make it taller. Right? So I get it to kind of where I want it to be, and then I'm going to delete history. Now, by deleting history, it's going to delete the memory that that deformer exists, and it's just going to think of this as a completely like new object, right? So if I go to edit, delete by type, history, that bend deformer is gone now, and I can do whatever I want to with this, and it'll stay in the same format. Now the reason, again, I do that is because now I have a lot of control on how I present this animation to the audience. Right, get this nice sort of subtle fall off in the background. It's not distracting. This is one method we can use. Okay. Now I'm going to zoom out here. And we're going to talk a little bit about this SkyDome light. How many of you have used this before in one of your previous animations? It's a good go-to because it's a one-click answer to be able to see your object when you hit render, right? It also is going to give you what in the past we would have called like a fake ambient occlusion pass. Let's kind of talk about what that means. Ambient occlusion is, if I zoom in here close, ambient occlusion is the very subtle shadow that's happening underneath my model here, right? You can kind of see that. You'll actually see this just looking around the room as well. Like if you look in corners and crevices, you'll see that it kind of gets darker in there. That's not necessarily a quote-unquote shadow. A shadow is the light is being blocked. So like direct light is being blocked by an object, right? What's actually happening there is indirect light, light that's kind of seeped through the windows, seeped in from all corners, is still bouncing around the room, and it just doesn't bounce into those crevices. Right? What you're not seeing in the SkyDome light render is any direct light, like any direct shadows, right? If you ask somebody like which direction is the light coming from, the answer is everywhere, right? The light is coming from all axes around you. So that's one of the reasons it kind of looks okay, is because that's true in most cases. If you go outside, like, yeah, the sun's up in the sky, but the entire sky is glowing, right? And sort of casting light down on you. And so light really does kind of come from all sorts of different directions, not from like one flashlight, right? Like in most cases. The problem with it is all of the light is perfectly white, right? There's just this like dome of white light coming at you. Okay? So that means the lighting feels very unrealistic and very uninteresting. It's very gray. Right? This is useful if you're wanting to show just the object itself. A lot of times these gray renders are used in modeling. That way people can just focus on the detail of the model and not be distracted by how you're trying to present the model. So you'll see this in like the game design classes and even the game design presentations, these gray renders to show off the model as effectively as possible. In this case, that's not necessarily what we're trying to do. We're trying to tell a little mini story here, right? And so we want to feel like this is actually real world lighting, right? So the SkyDome is actually still really useful for that. If I zoom out, again, all that's happening is it's casting white light. If we go over to our attribute editor right here, we'll see a couple of settings we can play around with to improve this lighting, including like intensity and exposure, which will allow us to adjust how bright the lighting is, right? Something else you'll notice is we have a little bit of grain going on in here. If you get in here to this render close enough, you'll start seeing that like here, it's very grainy, it's very like noisy, the background here. So remember when we talked about bounce light a couple of minutes ago, light is seeping in through the windows, it's bouncing all around the room, right? Why we're getting that is because Maya isn't going to work in the way that the real world works, where an infinite amount of light can be calculated for us to see. Like if we get closer and closer and closer to the wall, we will. It's not going to get grainier, right? It's not going to get more pixelated. In Maya, though, like there's no reason to calculate to that detail. because we aren't going to see it from that detail, and it would just take more processing power to do that. So Maya chooses how many like packets of light, how many little pieces of light to calculate, right? And it calls those samples. So we can turn up the number of samples right here, and it's going to clean up some of this noise, but it's also going to drive our render time up, right? So this is something I see all the way up to midpoint review of people having stuff that just still has a lot of that noise in the render. And that's a really easy way of fixing it, is just turning those samples up. And it should do... That's still looking a little noisy to me. Oh well, it's probably just my intensity is a little high too. And we can take that up even higher, but that's one of the ways we can start reducing how much noise we're getting in this. So I'll go ahead and put that back down to 1, because right now I want to talk more, like it's going to benefit us a little bit more to see faster renders. And I'm also going to set my intensity back to 1, just so we kind of have it at the default settings. Right. Now, again, the biggest challenge with this is that this giant SkyDome light has one color, right? It's white. If I were to change that to green and re-render, now our world is being like populated by green light from all directions, right? Which is also like not realistic, right? It paints everything with this green tint. So I think what's important to recognize here is that like when you go outside, you are not being bombarded by all white light, right? You are like the light that is bouncing around the world is partially white, partially blue from the color of the sky. Maybe you're walking through some trees, so there's some bounce light from the leaves. There's some bounce light from the grass on the ground or the concrete on the ground. And all of these things are adding color from all sorts of different directions. Now we can go in here and fill this scene full of a whole bunch of different lights that all have different, like a little green light that's coming up from the ground and a blue light that's coming from the sky. Maybe from the other side of the sky, we can have a little bit of an orange light for the color of the sun. And we can start to try to layer in all of those colors. And there's nothing wrong with doing it that way, but Maya's SkyDome light allows us to kind of use real-world lighting to color our scene. So again, I'll set this color back to white just so we can sort of start off with a fresh scene again. There we go. And what we're going to do under color is instead of just changing it all to one color, we're going to map in an image. So if we go up to, where's that folder at? This one will work. So if we go up to ETSU E3, under DIGM students, you'll see that there is this student resources folder. Right? And under that student resources folder is this HDR Panoramas. Let's see if we can open one of these up. I'm going to open up Airport. So if you double click on this, you'll notice that most of them are EXRs or HDRs. Okay. So what we're getting is this. Okay. This is a little confusing in terms of perspective, especially if you notice like this like weird streak of yellow along the edges here. So it's got two different attributes in it that make this usable for us, right? One is it's a panorama image, right? It's a full 360-degree view of this environment, okay? How they do that, there's a couple of different ways of doing it. It's actually getting much easier now because there's 360 cameras that will film in all 360 degrees of the view. And so you can just take a picture of it and get the entire environment around you, right, in one picture. It unwraps this in a spherical way, right? Which means to say if I applied this object to a sphere, it would wrap around it in a way that it would look like a full 360-degree environment. If you wrap this around that SkyDome that we're looking at, if we turn around, it's going to look like we're in that world. This is actually sort of the method that is used. Anybody ever on like Facebook or other apps, like people will post a panorama or post a 360-degree view, and you can kind of look around it. That's how some of the 360 VR stuff is done, right? So that's the first element that makes this usable, is that we can wrap this around that SkyDome, right? And it will feel like we are actually in the center of that environment, right? The other thing that makes this usable is that it's an HDR image. How many of you know what that stands for?
High resolution.
Close. So it's high dynamic range. It's an HDRI, high dynamic range image. So what that means is, if you open up an image in Photoshop, right, you have that levels or like that contrast bar, right? And if you move like your brightness and contrast all the way down to the bottom, it's completely black. If you move it all the way up to the top, it's completely white, right? And if we were to sort of define that range, it's from 0 to 1, right? And if you were to take a picture, many of you have done this before, taking a picture in your apartment where the light's kind of low, trying to take a picture of your cat or whatever, right? And it's a little too dark, and you take that into Photoshop and try to crank it up, you lose some of that information in the darks, right? Like you can't pull out the information that is hidden in there that was, it just starts getting grainy and ugly, right? The same thing as if you try to take a picture of the sun, you pretty much end up with this bright white picture that's washed out, and you can't pull down your contrast enough to see the details of the sun, right? That's just the normal range of brightness. There's a limit of how much white and black a single image can capture at one time, right? However, if we adjust our exposure, we could take a dozen different pictures, some of them where the sun is completely washed out everything, and some of them where we've turned our exposure down that we can see the detail of the sun, right? And we can get a larger range. Instead of having from 0 to 1, we could have negative 5,000 to positive 5,000, right? This image has that, right? So an EXR image means we're not left to that range of contrast that is in that image. We can adjust this in the same way we could adjust the exposure on our camera, right? And we can see that as if we go to image, adjust, exposure, and I start playing around with this. You can see I can start washing it out, or I can start bringing the details of those clouds back in, right? And so it's got a lot of range of brightness and contrast in there, right? And you'll also notice that it never quite gets all pixelated and nasty, right? Like here, it's washing it out, but it's not getting overly pixelated, right? So we're not really losing any detail in there. So let's go ahead and wrap one of these around our object. In fact, I'm just going to grab a few. Let's grab that airport scene. Let's do... there's one that's like... rooftop at night, industrial room. I'm just going to grab 3 or 4. Cedar Bridge, that one's a big one. So all those will work. Control C, and I'm going to go put these in my my folder for my project. Now again, I'm doing this because later Maya's going to look for it, right? Ball and bottle, source images. You'll actually see I already have one in here. It's this Brooklyn Bridge planks, right? But I'm just going to paste those in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the color of this to look at one of those images. So I'm going to click my little checkerboard here. That checkerboard always means we're going to go find something to map into this, right? And the thing I'm going to map into it is a file. The file I'm going to map into it is, let's try that airport one, right? And hit open. Now what you'll see is that it wrapped that airport around my SkyDome map, right? And it's going to use the light from that to illuminate our scene. Now there is a problem. Why is that not letting me change that? With some of these, which is usually we want our color space to be in raw. For some reason it's not letting us set that to that, but let's try when I hit open render view and hit play. So now it's going to illuminate it with the color from my scene, right? With the actual colors from this environment, okay? That means if I grab my SkyDome here and I rotate this, it's going to change the lighting on my object, right? So if I have like a sun direction coming from one side, I can make that sun direction part of my lighting in my scene. And so I can kind of focus this to where the brightness is coming from one side or the other. And then I can zoom back in there and get a little bit more realistic lighting. Now, again, because this is an HDR image, I can still turn up my exposure to like increase my brightness, right? So I can use this to get somewhat realistic looking lighting just with an image. Let's try mapping in a different image. In fact, I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to right click on color. I'm going to hit break connections. And then I'm going to go set my exposure back to 0. I'm going to go back to color. Let's try one of these others. Let's try... Why is that graying that out? So we have industrial room, which is going to look like it's lit interior lighting. Road to Tenerife Mountain. We had a cedar bridge. It's a big one. It may take a second. There we go. So if I hit that one and open it up, it's going to be kind of big. It's going to take it a minute or two to load. I may have to turn this off. I think it's because I'm pulling this over the network. It's just running slow. So hopefully that'll load up here in a second. And I can hit play again. There we go. Hit play again. There we are. And so now if I get in here a little closer, you're going to see my... my scene's starting to look a little bit more realistic, right? So this is actually something that is used quite a bit in visual effects, right? If you need to composite a 3D object into a real-world object, or into a real-world scene, right? Then if you have an HDR image of that real-world scene, you can light your 3D object as if it were really there, right? So think of it this way. You need the Hulk hulking out in the middle of Times Square, right? If you go to Times Square, shoot some footage of Times Square, gather an HDR map of Times Square at that same time you're shooting the footage, then you can go back and model the Hulk in Maya, animate the Hulk in Maya, and use the lighting from that footage you shot to light the Hulk in Maya, and then composite those together so it looks like the Hulk is actually standing in the middle of Times Square. So that's one of the ways that this is so beneficial, is that you can gather real-world lighting from that scene, right? It's also nice, though, just because we get a sampler of the complexity of light, right? So we may have, again, that bounce light coming from the ground. We may have some other light coming from the sky. We may have like spotlights that are red. Like all of that color of the light, if you want like a sunset scene, like that's very complex, like the colors that are coming through in that. And if you have an HDR image of that, you can use that to sort of get that mood in your lighting. I honestly do not know why this is like not letting me change this. This needs to be set to RAW instead of HD or instead of sRGB. But for some reason it's not letting me. So I'm going to break this one more time. And this time when I apply a material to it. What's up, Maya? Why are you being like this? There we go. There's another utility node, and so this may be how we do it, is under Arnold utility. There is a, if I just type file, F-I-L-E, textures, light, shaders. No? Interesting. Yeah. So there's this AI image node. We can use that one as well. But yeah, it's graying it out too. Maybe just by default, it's setting it to raw. So hopefully that's working. So this is why every time you teach this class, something has changed in Maya. So apparently that's the thing this time. So again, we can go to color. And just choose our file. What is happening? And let's try one of these others. Let's try Road to Tenerife Mountain. Arnold, open Arnold render view, hit play. Oh, that's nice and dark. So for that one, I guess I will need to bump up my exposure. I don't like any of that. I'm going to go back to the one I had before. There we go. So again, I can always turn up the samples a little bit, and this is going to hopefully give us a cleaner render. I can adjust my exposure a little bit to get us a little bit more brightness, contrast on there. Yeah. So now the other cool thing about this is that some of you maybe have tried to use some of the Maya presets in your materials like Chrome, right? And it may be working, but it's not working the best in the world. And the reason for that is because Chrome is a completely reflective material, right? It's like saying mirror, right? What color is a mirror? It's whatever color it's reflecting, right? And so for this to look like Chrome or whatever you want, oh, I have it locked, don't I? I want to go ahead and assign a new material. We'll go ahead and set this to AI standard surface, right? And on that AI standard surface material, I'm going to change my preset to Chrome and replace it, right? So it looks completely black in here, but when I hit play, you'll see one of the things that will actually make this look like chrome is the fact that it's reflecting an environment, right? When you have it set to chrome and all it's reflecting is white light coming from all directions, it just looks white, right? Like it doesn't have any of that that detail to it. So one of the things we're going to get out of this is it's going to reflect the environment around us. It's also going to reflect the floor, right? And that's going to update in real time as the ball gets closer. It should also reflect the ball. Where is the ball? So you're going to see the ball reflected in there as well, right? So actually, chrome is not a material I want this to have on it. One of the things I usually will do on here to sort of break this up a little bit, I'm at least going to put some different colors of materials on here. So I'm going to assign a new material. I'm going to do the AI standard surface. So that does just sort of automatically start looking a little bit more like a shampoo bottle. To me, it's a little too reflective, so I'm going to take down my specular a little bit. And I may even take down my color a little bit to gray or apply some other color to it. Now, I know some of you are probably wanting to put some textures on this. I plan on talking about textures a little bit more later. So right now I wouldn't sweat that too much. If you do want to do textures, recognize what we have to do is lay out our models, like topology, like the mesh. We have to lay that out in a way that we can create a texture for it. And so one of the reasons I don't really want to get into that today is if we go to Windows, Modeling Editors, UV Editor, this is how Maya thinks about our bottle when it comes to texturing, right? And that makes no sense at all. Like if I were going to use this to guide where I put textures on my model, it's really hard to understand as it is right now, right? What we need to do is be able to lay this out in a way that we can create a texture for it. If you're wanting to do that, I would say we can do that. You probably should do it before you deform the model, but we just go to UVs and we can try this automatic mapping. And what that's going to give us is a little bit of a different layout for those UVs, right? They're going to be shaped like this. And if we click like this checkerboard so you can kind of see what that means, it means that's how it's going to wrap the texture around the object. We're going to cover UVs a lot more next class period, or not next class period, but in the next project. If this is something you're really wanting to tackle, like jump into it, I don't want to try to cover it in a whole class. So recognize that how the bottle is textured is not going to affect the grade either here or in a midpoint later. So, but automatic mapping will get you a start, right? It's usually not the final solution for it, though, like the final answer you need for your texturing. Okay, so I have this bottle. I have it ready to render. So we're getting a render that kind of looks like this out of it. Maybe the only other thing I would consider is if I want to make this plane just a little less boring. Like I can right click on this, assign a new material to it, and instead of being completely gray, I'll go ahead and do an AI standard surface. I'm going to turn down my specular all the way because I don't want any highlights on this. And then maybe on my color, I'll put a checkerboard texture in there. So we get this checker texture. So we get something like this. To me, that's a little too strong, right? Like that's suddenly distracting again, right? But we can make this way more subtle, right? We can do like, let's say like this lighter blue, maybe make it a little gray. Right? And then this one, I can do that same color, except just a little bit darker. So we're going to get this really subtle checkerboard on there. Even more subtle than that. Right? And I can go to my Place 2D Texture node, which is right up here at the top, right? And change my repeat UVs from 4 to something like 10 and 10. And so now we kind of have this like subtle environment for it, right? This is something you see a lot in 3D, is this little checkerboard environment. This may not necessarily be what you want it to look like in yours. You could also go and download like a carpet texture or whatever it is you want to do with it. I just wanted to give it like a little bit of a world to live in, right? A little bit of a 3D space to exist in. And checkerboard usually allows us to see motion pretty well. So if what you're showing off is the motion, then this is a kind of neat way of showing that, right? Okay. So that's enough about lighting and rendering. I'm going to go File, Save Scene As. We'll do 10. Lit. There we go. And now I'm going to start working on my animation for this. Okay. So hopefully this is the part you're really kind of excited about, is making things move. I know not everybody has a rig to follow along with, but give me 1 second to pull up this file. So, when we were talking about, at the beginning of this project, we were talking about the bouncing ball, right? We went through it, we animated the bouncing ball, and we saw a couple of things happening in the bouncing ball animation, right? We saw that when the ball squashed, it was because it impacted the ground, right? It was reacting to the physics of impacting that ground. We saw that if we had that ball squashing before it got to the ground, it sort of broke that illusion that it was the forces that were causing that squash. So we put a little bit of stretch before and after that. We also saw like some. Let me hide this for a second, and I'll bring it back in a minute. We also saw some of the effects of arcs, right? That we realize the ball sort of bounces in these kind of smoother arcs, these bell curve arcs, and that it should be arcing at the top, not at the bottom, right? Because it doesn't ease in before it hits the ground, right? If you climb up on a table, jump off, you're not going to be able to slow down before you hit the ground, right? So we saw all these different things, and we were able to manipulate that, right? So what's the difference between a bounce and a jump? Anybody?
When you jump, kind of like,
Oh, that's cool. You're searching for it, and that's cool. Anybody want to chime in? How about
jumping is like an action you take yourself, and bouncing is more of a reaction to the environment.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody else have anything else they want to add to that? Similar. So, to me, yes.
maybe a jump, maybe you can go like the same height every time, where a bounce kind of slows down.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. How much control does this ball have over its trajectory, over its motion? It's none at all, right? And that's why that feels like a bounce, right? It feels like somewhere somebody imparted some energy on this, and all we're seeing is the effects of physics, right? Now, if you have a person jumping, you still have to show the effects of physics, but there's an added complication, which is intent, right? A jump feels intentional, right? Like that you have to be able to show that that character made the choice to jump, right? Now, a lot of the physical elements of a jump and a bounce are still there. It's actually really subtle things that that change it. So, for example, we have the ability to just jump once, right? We have the ability to make the second jump bigger than the first jump, as you pointed out. Like a ball, if you bounce a ball and it just bounces once and then stops, like it feels like some other force came in and stopped it, right? And so that's actually what we have, is we have the ability to incite forces. We have the ability to make forces happen. We ate our Raisin Bran this morning, and now we have energy, and we use that energy to make motion, right? The ball did not eat any Raisin Bran, it's not alive. And so when we see something that can control its own motion, that implies life, right? So we have these external forces that are applying to these objects: gravity, friction, drag. All of those things are not choices we get to make. I can't say, just going to ignore gravity today, float around, right? We don't have an option to ignore that. I do get to make the choice of, I'm going to take a step to the side, right? That choice, animators like to refer to that as internal force, right? I have the ability to internally make a new action happen, whereas a non-living object does not have that choice, does not have that option, right? And so that is something we have to show as animators. We have to show that decision-making process. So for example, a ball does not anticipate and squash down before it starts bouncing, right? If it does, it feels like it's alive. So this anticipation is like, dude's just standing here, waiting around, and he's like, you know what? I think I'm going to jump. Before he jumps, he has to build up that energy. That is a conscious decision to squash down and build up that energy. Then to get off the ground, he has to push off of the ground with that Raisin Bran power he acquired earlier this morning, right? He converts that potential energy into kinetic energy and pushes against the ground, right? Now, whatever he does with his limbs while he's up in the air, that's one thing. But he is still under the control of gravity, right? That's why he had to push so hard to jump. And eventually he's going to reach the peak of that jump, and gravity is going to overcome that that energy that he used to push off the ground, start pulling him back down to the ground, right? Now, if anybody's ever tried to land from a jump with your knees bent, you realize that's a bad idea. Like that's a weakened state. And so if your knees are bent when you land, they'll probably crumple underneath you and you'll hit the ground. So usually what we do is we stretch out before we land, right? If we stretch out before we land, then that gives our body the maximum amount of space to absorb that energy when we hit, right? All of our weight is being pulled on by gravity, and if we land like bent-kneed or land in some weakened pose, it's actually harder for us to slow that momentum, right? So that's why we usually stretch out before we impact. Again, the reason we stretch out when we jump is because we have to get our butts off the ground, right? We got to get up in the air, right? And so you're pushing as hard as you can. You also can't really jump very well bent-kneed, right? If you don't push yourself off as hard as you can, it's just going to be a little like, I don't even know that I can do it. Like, try to jump without straightening your knees all the way out, right? Some people who are much more athletic may be able to do it. The squash at the end of this, I'm calling it recovery, right? That's you absorbing that energy, right? You absorb that from the impact. You absorb that energy from the impact, And then after that's absorbed, you can kind of get back to a state of equilibrium, right? Back to a neutral state, right? This is important. All of these different elements have to be there to be understandable as a jump, right? Now, some of these elements don't have to be there for a bounce, but they have to be there for a jump, right? If we go straight from this to up in the air, it looks like something picked our character up, right? If we go straight from squashed to up in the air, it looks like some other force other than him pushing against the ground is what caused him to go up in the air, right? If we go straight from our neutral to our contact of our jump right here, it's going to feel like the character didn't build up enough energy to get up into the air, right? So all of these are important. Right? They all are required to show that physical action. And I know that this this may sound overstated, but you're going to be reanimating this jump in different ways, like almost every day of your career. So here's an interesting thing to note. Every one of these poses are required every time you pick your foot off of the ground, right? Every time my foot comes off the ground, I need to go from a neutral, at least the anticipation a little bit, but not really. That's more in the hips, right? This is where you push off the ground with your toe. Your foot has to come up in the air. Your foot has to contact the ground again, and your foot has to flatten out again. It takes 5 different poses every time you pick your foot off the ground, right? And you pick your foot off the ground a lot. So we think about this because the physics of this is going to replicate all over the place. The same with the bouncing ball. Those two elements I will refer back to so often because the arcs that you see in a bouncing ball, the poses that you see in this jump, they're going to replicate like in all sorts of more complicated animations. So let's use this as sort of a template to make our bottle jump. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and start animating. I'm going to move this off to the side because I already know these. I'll pull them back periodically. First thing, before I start animating, I need to figure out where I'm looking at this from, right? I need to set up my camera. So I'm going to create a new camera. The reason I do this is because I don't want to keep messing up my old camera, right? I don't want to get my camera perfect and then need to be able to tumble around and see something from a different angle. So I'm going to go here and say create cameras, camera. So I have a new camera. There it is, camera 2. And I'm going to go to panels and layouts, and I'm going to do 2 panes side by side. Now, this is my perspective camera. I can tumble around wherever I want to. From this camera, I am going to set it to camera 2, which is apparently my new one I just made. Right? And I'm going to set this camera up to be how my shot is going to render. Now again, this is a nice angle and all, right? But if I render this, you're going to see that the render I get, set that to, what? Is camera 2 not an option? Okay, let's go ahead and set this to my regular, what is happening? Let's just render from this. Okay. Camera 2. I'm actually going to rename that camera to render cam just to see if that fixes it. For some reason, Arnold isn't recognizing. Oh, it says it is, but when I hit play, it's not updating. That seems like a bug. It will still render correctly from this camera. If I select render cam and render from here. What I really wanted to show you is that the shape of this render is this oblong HD setting, right? And so the things that are in this scene are not going to always be visible in my view over here, right? Because if I look at my panel, it's this really long, tall shape. Right? I'm going to go ahead and add my ground plane to a layer just so I don't accidentally keep selecting it. So this is what I'm seeing here. This is what I'm seeing in my render, and there's all of this other stuff that's showing up in the render that I'm not seeing in my viewport, right? So what I usually do is from my render cam, I will turn on this button right here. It's the one with the little blue dot. It's our resolution gate. And this will allow me to see what will actually show up in my render, right? It will also allow me to see over here, this is like my perspective camera. So I can adjust this a little bit, but I really just need to be able to see what my framing is going to look like once I render it, because then I can start setting up a more appealing shot, right? So maybe I'll do something like this. This is usually what I do, right? My ball is bouncing in from this side, right? And I want to make sure that my bottle has the opportunity to kind of jump over it, right? So it's right about there is where the impact is. So I'm going to start my animation with my bottle kind of like right here. Sort of turn it a little bit toward the camera. Right? Maybe move my camera a little bit more like this. Just kind of getting my shot set up. Right? I want to give myself enough room for my bottle to jump. And I also want to have my ball kind of go off screen a little bit. So to me, that's a little too close on that ball. I may do a little bit of something more like this. So it comes in from the side. Right? Yeah, there we go. And then this will be the point at which my bottle jumps over it. So there we go. So that's feeling pretty good. Maybe zoom out just a touch more. Something like this. Okay. So that's a lot of like little tweaking I just did, like meandering like around to try to get my shot set up. That process is called layout, right? In an animation studio, this is something that somebody does for every shot. It's actually a separate job usually in a film, where somebody goes in, sets up the camera to show it off the way you want it to show it off. And what you do not want to do is go messing up somebody's hard work or even messing up your hard work by just tumbling your camera around again and losing this shot, right? What I usually do is once I have this set up for my render cam, I will click this button right here, which is this lock camera. So we have this is our select camera, which will select the camera we're viewing through. This button locks the camera we're viewing through. And you'll see that when I click that over here in my channel box, the translates and rotates are going to go gray. So I can turn that on and off, right? But when they're gray, that means I can't tumble around with it. Somebody have their hand up a minute ago? That's all my proof. Huh? Oh, that's cool. If you have questions, slow me down, and we can chat. So this means I'm not going to accidentally mess up my render camera. But if I need to see all of this from a different angle, I can use my perspective camera. Right? Now this is the camera I'm going to render from, obviously. This is the camera I can like tumble around in here and get from whatever angle I need to select stuff. Okay. So we have it pretty close now. I'm going to go ahead and start animating. First thing I usually do is figure out when my ball needs to jump, or my bottle needs to jump. It's about frame 12. That's a little early. What I'm probably going to do, just to make this a little more interesting, my ball doesn't bounce into screen or doesn't do anything off screen. So I can actually shift all of my ball animation down a little later. So I have my ball selected. I'm going to move all of this stuff down to where we get our first impact closer to frame 35, right? 30, it's like 36. And the reason for that is that'll give my bottle a few seconds to anticipate, right? Maybe go a little bit later than that. Maybe something more like 45. Okay, so 45 is that impact. That means my bottle needs to jump over the ball before that, right? Okay. So this is where all of that rigging is going to come in handy. Right? We've spent all of that time putting all those controllers on here. I have a squash and stretch, I have my bend rotate, I have my bend height, I have a bend, right? All of these different controllers. And all of these are on this one control. So that means I can just set all of my keyframes on this one control to do all of my poses. All of those poses from this image, I'm going to kind of translate those onto my bottle using these deformers, right? So I'm going to hit S to get us a starting pose. I usually, need to make sure I'm in mute. And that's going to set a keyframe on all of those channels. Now, usually I don't want my bottle feeling too stiff. So just for kind of aesthetic reasons, I will usually start my object, especially if it's alive, I'll start my object off with a little bit of a pose already, right? So let's just play with this a little bit. I can bend it a lot there. You'll see the bend is coming, or is side to side right now. So I can take that back to like 90 to where it's leaning back a little bit, right? Maybe bend it forward a little bit. Now I have to be kind of careful here to not accidentally like scrub my timeline and lose that pose. So I spent a little bit of time keying that. I'm going to hit S now again to make sure that I update those keyframes, right? I usually use auto key. And so the reason for that is without auto key, let's say I go ahead and start making my anticipation pose, and I do squash here, and I do my bend forward, right? I maybe set my bend rotate back to 90, so that makes a little bit more sense. Maybe I rotate it a little bit like this, and I'm like, yes, that's it. I am super happy with that pose. Let's see what it looks like. And I scrub it and I lose the pose, right? It's very easy to forget to hit S, right? So I usually will turn on auto key so it doesn't lose that, but I still hit S as often as I can to make sure I'm keying all of those channels, right? So let's go ahead and do that again very quickly. Turn auto key on. I'll get my bend back to here. And you'll see now whenever I make a change, it's keying those values, right? I'm going to get the bend even more. I'm going to rotate the bottle's base back just a little bit. And that way you can see what we're getting now is like this and this anticipation, right? And I can sort of tumble around here and try to read these a little bit better. So for example, I'm not super happy with that. There we go. Now, something that is very useful for me, hopefully it is a little bit for you as well, is the greater than, less than keys. So if I use the greater than, it's next to the M key, the greater than, less than, it allows me to step back and forth between my two poses. And that's because what we're actually doing right now is the pose-to-pose workflow. We remember that from the 12 principles of animation. They're straight ahead or pose-to-pose. What I'm doing right now is I'm not worrying about frame 2 or 5 or 10 or 15, right? I'm just worrying about my poses on frame 1 and frame 20. Maya is going to try to figure out the rest of those. It's going to do it poorly, and I'm going to have to sort of go in and fix it. But right now, my step to make sure I'm getting this animation down correctly is getting all of these main poses. Part of the hard part of this is learning how to recognize those poses, like learning how to figure out what is a key pose and what's not, right? But let's go ahead and go back here. So I got my pose on pose 1. I got this anticipation pose, but I don't need it to actually jump until frame 45, right? So really what I'm doing here is I'm building some anticipation into this by making this pose last longer, right? So again, I don't have all of my keyframes on here. I'm going to hit S just to make sure frame 20 has all those keyframes. I'll go out to about frame, let's try 38, and I'm just going to push all of these a little bit more. I'm going to bend it just a little bit more. I'm going to rotate it back just a little bit more, or maybe I'm going to start rotating it forward a little bit more. I'm going to squash it just a little bit more. And so what you're going to see is like, I got to my anticipation pose, but I keep pushing it even further, right? And what that's going to do is it's going to make it feel like it's sort of hanging out here and like building up that energy even longer. Now, where I need it to take off is right about here, right? So I really want that to happen kind of quickly. I want to go between this anticipation pose and this jump pose in probably like 2 frames. It's going to be really fast. The reason for that is if it's slow, it's not going to feel like the character pushed off hard, right? Like if it's slow, it's going to feel like that. And that's not got enough energy to get me off the ground, right? So we need to make this fast, like pop it from this anticipation to that jump. I'm going to try 2 frames. I maybe could do it in 3. Let's see if we can do that over 38. About frame 40, right, is where I'm going to set my next keyframe. And for that, I want to bend my character backwards, rotate him forward, stretch him. Oh, maybe I bent him too far back. And that's way too stretched. Something like this. So I can bend him back a little bit more, but maybe raise my bend height a little bit. That way I can just get this bend in the head. I think that's maybe just a little much on the stretch. Let's try it right about there. So let's see what that looks like. We got neutral, squash, more squash, stretch. Okay. Problem with this is I think I made it happen a little too early. So I'm going to grab these keyframes, scoot those just a little later to where it happens right about there. Let's see what that does. There we go. So for me, I need to see where my object is going to land. I actually think I might have to change my framing of this just a little bit as well. So the amount of time my character's up in the air is important. I'm going to have him be up in the air just a little less than 10 frames. I'm going to bring him down about frame 52, 53. Let's try 53. Okay, because 53's contact pose is actually very similar. You'll see our contact where we push off is very similar to our contact where we land, right? And so really what I'm doing is I'm just borrowing that pose and changing it. Slide my character forward, rotate it backward. And I'm doing this for a few reasons. Go ahead and maybe bend it forward again, like this. One of the reasons for this is because that was a quick pose to set, right? I was able to borrow elements for one and get a pretty quick pose for the second one. The other thing is that now when I need my up pose in the middle, I can find out exactly kind of where that needs to be. So if I go to the middle of that, Maya will give me sort of a rough answer. This is where I need to be, right? And so I can go through now, move my character up in the air. Let's try it to here. Take my squash down a little bit. Take my bend back a little bit. So just kind of play with this. Yes. Now, one of the things I have that's happening here that I'm not very happy with is that my character is going off screen. The other thing is I think he's landing, or I think it's landing just a little too close to this edge. So layout is not perfect. Layout is a starting point, and we kind of have to adjust that a little bit, right? So I'll probably go back and change my layout, or I'll change my animation to make this line up a little bit better. So I need my my squash pose now. I'll go ahead and zero out my rotate X, so it'll be flat on the ground. I'll add a little bit more squash to this. I'm messing up my pose. Sorry, I need to go out here a little further. So again, my stretch to my squash is going to be pretty quick too. All right, like that. 0. lower my bend height, lower the bend amount. So now we get that, and then sort of slowly I'll have my character go back up to sort of a neutral pose. So probably about frame 68, right? I can go back up to something a little more neutral. Right. So if we watch this, not bad. I think my squash needs to happen a little faster. To get to there, that's just a little slow. So I'll go ahead and make that a little slower, or a little faster. I also think it needs to kind of hold it a little bit down there. So I can sort of borrow from, say, frame 57, hit S, sort of scoot that down a little later. So it's going to stay there a little longer and then kind of pop up. I can also kind of do what we call a moving hold. You'll know that notice that after this is over, my character sort of pops back up and then freezes, right? If something's alive, it never completely stops. It's always moving just a little bit. So you can keep making more key poses out there a little bit just to kind of give it like a breathing feel or something like that. But sometimes you can just kind of borrow previous key poses to make that happen. So, for example, I can get one from like right here, where it's right before it, hit S, and then just drag this out a little longer. I feel like frame 90 is probably the end of my animation, so that's feeling okay like that. Okay. Now this is the first pass of animation. The next thing we have to do is the graph editor. Again, I need to reiterate, the graph editor is not really optional. Right? There are sometimes you can get away with making an animation and not having to do too much in the graph editor. But this is where like I can make some big sweeping changes pretty quickly. Go to my animation view. So my translate Y is my forward and back, right? So I don't really need to do too much with it. My translate my translate X is forward and back. Translate Y is up and down. So even though it may not seem that bad right now, I still think I can get a better result by breaking these tangents. So I'll go here to these tangents. You'll see that that's how quickly it goes from here to up in the air. And if you notice that first frame from here to up there, that's really like a small distance it travels, and then the distance gets bigger and bigger. And so that's not really how force works. So I would go ahead and break those tangents, point those up a little bit. And I think that's going to fix a lot of stuff. My rotations, so this is really what I'm usually looking for in the graph editor. This is my rotation, I think this is my rotation forward and back. And what you'll notice happens is my character rotates forward just a little bit, or rotates back just a little bit, starts rotating forward again, rotates forward really sharply, but then doesn't really follow through with that, right? And then like it just got a lot of these areas where it flattens out. Usually when these areas flatten out like this, it's going to feel like there's a hiccup. So what I can start doing now is sort of playing around with these keys and getting these to feel a little softer in the way they're moving. This is also where we can get some of that moving hold that we were talking about. If I ever get to a point where I'm like, I need some more keyframes in here, this is kind of hard to remember. You can go to Keys, Add Key Tool. Now you have to select the curve in some way or another, right? And then middle click, and you can add another key and position that, right? And so this is just a little like couple of changes I did, and hopefully it got rid of some of those hiccups. Right? And sort of the last thing we can do is we can also offset stuff. So this is my bend deformer. I can put an extra keyframe on that. Oops, sorry. Put an extra keyframe on that. I can sort of play around with this as well. Or I can grab all of these and have them happen at a slightly different time, right? Like I could have my bend happen one frame later. Now, doing all of this means that my playback of this hopefully is going to feel a little more polished now, right? So that feels just a little better now just by fixing a few of those things. Still think there's still some stuff I could polish around with. Sort of the last thing I would do is I would go in here and unlock my camera and make sure my bottle doesn't actually jump out of frame. So maybe doing it a little bit more like this. And that way my layout looks a little bit better. I could probably also do it like maybe just a touch close. So once I have that, I can lock it. I can start rendering. Okay, we're getting kind of close on time. It's 10:02. I think this class gets out at 10:05. Is that right? 10:15. Okay. All right. Well, we're still all right. I'm sure some of you will have questions. I know we kind of went through the animation part relatively quickly. I want you to kind of play with this and see what you can do. Like I did kind of a vanilla jump. Like it's not that not as interesting as it could be. Is there a way you can make yours more interesting? Like, is your bottle curious about this ball that's jumping and then it almost hits it and it has to jump sideways out of the way? Like, I just tried to have mine jump over the ball, right? You can interpret this however you want to. It just needs to have a rig in the bottle so it deforms and feels like it's jumping. One of the things that hurt people the most is thinking, I don't need to rig that bottle. I'll just have it, like, fall over to the side or something. Well, then it doesn't feel alive, right? So put something in there like to get some form of animation on it. I think we've covered lighting and rendering now in a way that should allow you to get a pretty decent render out of this. So the rest of it is just work time for you. The rest of it is just, why is this thing always rendering that incorrectly? So the rest of it's just work time for you to be able to finish this up and get a piece out the door that looks pretty good. Again, I'll be in here on Friday, and that's going to be the best time to ask me questions. I'll also be here, I'll be in the building tomorrow. In my office, I have office hours kind of earlier that morning. I'll probably be in a little later at 9-ish, something like that, so 9 to about 2 when I have another class. So you're welcome to stop by any of those times if you have questions. And I'll swing by here on Friday morning to check in on you. I know some people were having some issues with the render farm over the break, but I think they got those ironed out. So otherwise, have a great day. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll go ahead and stop this video, upload it to the YouTube page. So you have it. Yes. Okay, give me just a minute.